The desert had a way of swallowing sound. By dusk, even Ethan Price's own breath seemed muffled by the vast emptiness around him. The sun, low and cruel, had bled the horizon into bruised shades of purple and copper, and the last thing Ethan remembered of his company was the dust their horses had kicked up as they rode ahead, leaving him trailing after a mule that had gone lame. He had promised himself he'd catch up once he set the animal right. That was hours ago. Now, as night came crawling over the mesas, Ethan realized just how far alone he was. The heat of day lingered in the rocks, but the air cooled fast, and the silence pressed heavier than the desert's weight. His mount shifted nervously, ears twitching at every unseen stir. Ethan tried to tell himself it was just coyotes, maybe a rattler in the brush. But deep inside, in that marrow-level place a man can't explain, he knew he wasn't alone. He kept his rifle across his lap as he rode, every sense straining for something, anything, that would break the suffocating quiet. Then it came. Not a sound, not even a shadow. Just movement, a whisper of air, and then hands like iron dragged him off his horse. His rifle clattered uselessly against stone. Ethan hit the ground hard, a boot driving into his chest before he could recover. Knife came next, cold against his throat, sharper than his thoughts could keep pace with. His vision cleared just enough to see the figure crouched over him, dark braids spilling over painted skin, eyes steady and unblinking, holding him as still as the desert itself. Apache. Every story he had ever heard in the barracks flashed through. Ethan's mindmen skinned alive, patrols erased without a trace, women and children carried off into a fate worse than death. His pulse thrashed against the blade at his neck, and he realized with chilling clarity that this was how he would die, alone, forgotten, claimed by a people he had been raised to hate and fear. But the warrior didn't strike. He didn't move, except to tighten his grip on the knife. Ethan's chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, and in that thin space between breaths, he saw something unexpected in the Apache's eyes. It wasn't blind fury. It wasn't bloodlust. It was thought, deliberation, as if the warrior were weighing a decision heavier than steel. Ethan swallowed, the blade pricking his skin with emotion. His hands twitched against the dirt, but he dared not fight. The Apache leaned close enough that Ethan could smell smoke on his skin and the copper tang of dried blood. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, yet carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I could end you now," the Apache said in measured English, his accent sharp but clear. "One cut, and you are nothing." Ethan shut, his eyes bracing for the end. But the pressure of the blade eased just barely. "You are young," the warrior continued. "Your blood is not yet worth spilling. But listen to me, soldier. I'll spare you tonight, but my condition will haunt you forever." The words cut deeper than the knife ever could. Ethan's eyes flew open, searching the warrior's face for meaning. But there was none to be found, only a promise coiled like a rattler waiting to strike in some unseen future. Before Ethan could speak, the Apache dragged the blade across his cheek in a deliberate arc, not to kill, but to mark. The pain seared. Hot, bright, unforgettable. Ethan cried out, clutching at the wound, but when he looked up, the warrior was already gone, vanishing into the desert shadows as silently as he had appeared. Alone again, Ethan staggered to his feet. Blood trickled warm down his chin, and his horse snorted nervously nearby, unscathed. The silence returned, heavier than before, but now it carried with it the echo of that voice. Those words that would chase him far longer than the scar itself. "I'll spare you tonight," Ethan whispered to the empty desert, as if speaking them aloud might loosen their grip. But the darkness swallowed his words whole, and the mark on his face burned like a brand. Ethan stumbled through the desert night, half guided by moonlight, half dragged by the reins of his jittery horse. The cut on his cheek still bled, though. Not enough to weaken him, just enough to remind him of the Apache's blade with every pulse of pain. He tried to press a kerchief to it, but the desert wind turned the cloth stiff and sticky almost immediately. The horse whickered, ears flicking toward every rustle in the sagebrush. Ethan whispered calming words, though he hardly believed them himself. He had escaped death, yes, but something in the warrior's words clung to him worse than the sting of the wound. "I'll spare you tonight, but my condition will haunt you." Forever, Dot. It wasn't just a threat. No, the Apache could have slit his throat where he lay. Instead, he had chosen to leave him alive and marked. That thought gnawed at Ethan as he pressed on, each step heavier than the last, his boots filled with sand, his lips cracked. The stars burned cold above him, indifferent. Hours later, he reached a dry arroyo where mesquite twisted against the moon. There he collapsed beside his horse, pulling his canteen from the saddlebag. A swallow of water burned his throat raw, but he forced himself to sip sparingly. The night was only beginning, and the desert gave no second chances. He tried to rest, leaning against the warm flank of his horse, but sleep brought no peace. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Apache's face again, calm, deliberate, merciless without cruelty. In his dreams, the knife hovered not at his throat but at his soul, cutting away everything he thought he knew of himself. When the dawn came, it did not bring relief. The rising sun turned the desert into a furnace. Once more, and Ethan dragged himself onto his saddle, pushing north toward where he believed Fort Stanton lay. His scar ached, throbbing like a second heartbeat. By midday, he had begun to feel as though the Apache had left more than a mark, something unseen pressed against his spirit, some weight too heavy for one man to bear. At last, as the sun dipped westward, he spotted the flutter of a flag above adobe walls in the distance. Relief nearly toppled him from the saddle. He pressed his heels into the horse, urging it toward salvation. The gates opened at his call, and soldiers rushed out to meet him. Ethan slid from the saddle, staggering on weak legs, his hand still pressed to his cheek. He must have looked half-ghost, himself dust-covered, blood-streaked, and wide-eyed. "Price? By God, we thought you were gone," one of the men exclaimed, steadying him by the shoulders. Ethan wanted to answer, to explain, but his tongue stuck in his mouth. He let them lead him inside, where the fort surgeon dabbed at his wound with whiskey and rough cloth. The sting made him hiss, but it was the surgeon's words that cut deeper. "You'll live," the man said flatly, tying the bandage tight, "though that scar will live longer. You're marked now, son." The other soldiers gathered close, curious, whispering among themselves. One of them, an old corporal with half a hand missing, leaned in to mutter, "Ghost marked. That's what the Apaches call it. When they cut you but don't kill you, means you carry something worse than death." Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to deny it, laugh it off, but the weight of the Apache's words pressed against his memory. Like a brand. He could still feel the warrior's breath, hear that low voice promising a condition he could never escape. The surgeon patted his shoulder, but his expression was grim. "You were spared for a reason, lad. And reasons with Apaches, those. Don't come cheap." Ethan sat there in silence, the whispers of his comrades swirling around him. The fort, meant to feel like safety, now felt like a cage. The Apache had spared him, yes, but in that mercy, Ethan realized he had been condemned to something far more enduring than death. That night, as he lay in his bunk, unable to sleep, Ethan touched the fresh scar on his cheek and whispered the words aloud, "I'll spare you tonight." The desert beyond the walls seemed to listen. For 3 days, Ethan Price moved about Fort Stanton like a man caught between waking and dreaming. The surgeon had stitched and bound the wound, but no bandage could hide the scar that already pulled tight against his skin, raw and angry, and the mirror-polished tin plate he used to shave. The men never said much to his face, not directly. But Ethan could feel their eyes following him at the mess table, on the drill grounds, even in the chapel. A private would nudge another and whisper, lips curling just enough to shape the words. Ghost-marked dot at first, Ethan tried to ignore it. Soldiers thrived on stories after all legends of luck, curses, omens. He told himself it would pass, that they'd forget soon enough. But he knew they wouldn't, not when they could see the truth carved plain into his cheek. The commander, Captain Wilkes, called him into his office on the second night. The captain was a square man, built like a block of stone, his uniform always pressed, boots gleaming even in the dust of New Mexico territory. His eyes narrowed the moment Ethan entered. "You've been absent 2 days, Price," Wilkes said, his tone clipped. "You reappeared with a wound and without your patrol. I'll need a report." Ethan stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back. "Yes, sir. I was separated from the unit when my mount fell lame. During the night, I was attacked by an Apache scout. He had me at his mercy, sir." Wilkes's brow furrowed. "And yet you're standing here. Explain." Ethan hesitated. The memory came rushing back. The weight of the warrior's knee, the cold line of the blade, the voice that had bound him tighter than any rope. He opened his mouth, closed it again. What could he say? "He spared me, Captain, but he cursed me. With words I don't yet understand." That would earn him more than suspicion. It might earn him a posting in the infirmary with the madman. Finally, Ethan said, "He cut me and let me go, sir. I don't know why." Wilkes leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the wood. His eyes stayed locked on Ethan's face, as if trying to read the scar like a map. "Apaches don't let men go, Price. Not unless they've already taken what they wanted. You keep this from me, and you endanger this whole fort. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said, though the words burned his throat. Dismissed, he stepped out into the cool night, his gut twisting. The moon hung high over the parade ground, silvering the adobe walls. The men gathered in small knots around cook fires, their voices low, laughter carrying with an edge of unease. Ethan walked past them, and conversation thinned wherever he went. He could feel the distance growing, an invisible gulf widening between himself and the rest. By the third night, sleep had become impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the whispers returned. Not the men's whispers, those were bad enough, but others, softer, carried on the wind. Words he couldn't understand, yet felt in his bones. Shadows in his dreams showed him fire, war paint, the clash of steel and cries of the dying. He woke drenched in sweat, clutching at his scar as though it were bleeding fresh again. At dawn, an old scout named Braddock approached him by the stables. Braddock was half crippled from an arrow years back, his hair gone white under a battered hat. He studied Ethan's face for a long time, saying nothing, before finally muttering, "They marked you, boy." Ethan stiffened. "What does it mean?" Braddock spat in the dust. "It means you're not just spared. You're claimed. Apache don't waste steel for no reason. You'll find out soon enough what condition they've bound you to." The words hollowed Ethan more than he wanted to admit. He wanted to call the man a liar, to laugh it off like barracks talk. But deep down, the truth was already gnawing at him, because every time the wind shifted, Ethan could almost hear the Apache warrior's voice again. "I'll spare you tonight, but my condition will haunt you forever." And the haunting had already begun. The first haunting came quietly. Ethan had been sitting alone in the mess hall long after the others left. The fire in the hearth burned down to a sullen glow. He'd been tracing the rim of his tin cup with one finger, staring at the reflection of his scar in the dull metal. His eyes felt gritty, his body heavy with a kind of exhaustion that came not from drills or marshes, but from the gnawing weight of unrest, When he finally rose and returned to the barracks, he told himself he would sleep, must sleep. But sleep did not come willingly. His body lay still under the coarse blanket, yet his mind roamed wide, chasing the memory of the Apache's voice until it slipped into dream. That was when the fire came down. It began as a flicker in the corner of his vision, a lantern overturning, a spark in the dry grass. Then it roared into an inferno, swallowing huts, tents, everything. He saw women clutching children, running into the dark only to be cut down by mounted riders. He smelled hair burning, flesh crackling, the acrid stench of gunpowder mixing with the sweetness of mesquite smoke. And through it all, he saw warriors painted red and black, their mouths open in cries that were part battle and part grief. Ethan stood among them, though he did not move, as if the fire belonged to him, as if the smoke had risen from his own hands. He woke with a strangled cry, clutching at the scar on his cheek. His bunkmates stirred, one of them swearing at him to shut his mouth. Ethan sat upright, chest heaving, sweat plastering his hair to his temples. The dream clung to him with such force that for a moment he could still feel the heat, still hear the crack of rifles in the dark. He tried to calm himself, to drink from the tin of water by his cot, but his hand shook so badly that most of it spilled down his front. Lying back down was impossible. The moment he closed his eyes, the flames leapt up again, demanding to be seen by morning. His face was pale, eyes hollow. Captain Wilkes noted it at inspection, narrowing his gaze. "You look half dead, Price. Get your rest, or you'll be useless in the field." Ethan nodded mutely, but rest was the one thing beyond his grasp. The second night, the visions came without sleep. He had been patrolling the perimeter at dusk, rifle slung over his shoulder, when he heard it, whispers on the wind. He froze, heart thudding. At first he thought it was his fellow sentries, but the voices were different, softer, strange in rhythm. Foreign syllables woven into the rustling of sage and grass. He turned in a circle, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. The whispers grew clearer until he swore they were speaking into his ear. Then the air changed, thick with the smell of smoke. His scar burned suddenly, as though the Apache's knife had just cut him anew. He staggered, clutching his face, and the desert blurred before him. For an instant, he wasn't standing outside the fort at all. He was in a canyon, its walls streaked with red ochre, warriors dancing in the firelight. Drums pounded against his skull. A painted figure stepped from the circle, eyes locking on his the same warrior who had spared him. Ethan blinked, and the canyon was gone. He was back at the fort wall, a fellow sentry shaking him by the shoulder. "You all right, Price? You went slack there for a minute." "Fine," Ethan croaked, though his voice betrayed him, but he wasn't fine. Not anymore. That night, alone, in his bunk, Ethan pressed his palm against the scar. It throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and he realized it wasn't just a wound. It was a tether, a mark tying him to something far larger, far darker than himself, and no surgeon, no commander, no priest could cut it free. By the end of the week, Ethan looked less like a soldier of the United States Army and more like a hollow-eyed drifter dragged in from the desert. His uniform hung loose where sleep and meals had failed him, and dark bruises bloomed under his eyes. The other men noticed. They always noticed. "Ghost-marked," one whispered as Ethan passed by the mess line. "Speaks to the spirits now, I heard," another muttered. Ethan gritted his teeth but said nothing. A soldier could fight a man, even two or three, but you couldn't fight whispers. They seeped into every corner, corroding faster than rust. That evening, while the sun bled its last light across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Ethan found himself in the stables, brushing down his horse in silence. The rhythmic scrape of bristles against hide was the only thing that settled him anymore. His scar itched and throbbed as though alive, But for once, the voices were quiet. He didn't hear Braddock enter until the old scout leaned his crooked frame against the stall door. "You've been walking like a man chased," Braddock said, his voice low and raspy. As if the desert wind had worn it down over the years, Ethan stiffened. "I'm fine." Braddock gave a humorless chuckle. "Fine. Men don't wake the barracks screaming. Fine men don't stare off at nothing with eyes wide as a spooked colt." Ethan paused, brush still in hand. "You know something about it, don't you?" The old scout shifted, his weight settling on the leg less ruined by an arrow. His eyes, pale and sharp beneath the brim of his hat, held no mockery, only recognition. "I've seen it before. Years back, when I was young and still thought I'd outlast this land. Apache could have killed a sergeant I rode with. Didn't. Marked him instead like you. Said it bound him to their dead." Ethan's breath caught. "What happened to him?" Braddock spat into the straw. "He lasted a season, maybe two. Started hearing things, seeing things. Could track an Apache patrol like he was born to it, but he swore every night their ghosts crawled into his dreams. One day he just walked out into the desert. Never saw him again." The words sank like lead into Ethan's gut. His scar burned hot, as though to confirm every syllable. He swallowed hard. "So what am I supposed to do? Ignore it? Pretend it's not real?" Braddock leaned in closer. "Doesn't matter what you pretend. Their condition don't care if you believe in it. It'll work its way into your bones all the same." Ethan set down the brush with shaking hands. "You think I'm cursed?" "I don't think it." Braddock said, "I know it." The silence stretched. Outside, coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls echoing across the plain. Ethan turned back to his horse, brushing hard enough to make the animal shift uneasily. "Well, I'm not your sergeant," he said tightly. "I'll fight it." Braddock's laugh was dry, empty of mirth. "You don't fight the Apache's mercy, boy. You carry it until it breaks you." With that, he hobbled out of the stable, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the soft snorts of his horse. That night, when the visions came again, flashes of painted faces, the smell of blood on dry sand, the echo of drums, Ethan clenched his fists and forced himself upright. He muttered through his teeth, "I'll fight it. I'll fight it." But the scar pulsed beneath his hand like a living thing, and deep down he knew Braddock was right. Condition was already inside him, and ignoring it would not make it go away. The chance to test Braddock's warning came sooner than Ethan wished. It was near dawn when the alarm bell clanged across Fort Stanton, pulling every man from his bunk. Ethan stumbled from his cot, rifle in hand, boots half laced. The scar on his cheek already burned, and some buried instinct told him why. The Apache were near. Captain Wilkes barked orders on the parade ground. Scouts reported movement east of the canyon. "We ride at once. Mount up." Horses stamped, men cursed and saddled, and within minutes the gates opened to spill blue-coated riders into the desert. Ethan rode among them, the air cold and sharp, every nerve alive. He should have felt the usual tangle of fear and adrenaline. Instead, something stranger stirred in him an awareness, a tether pulling him forward. By midday, they found the Apache. Not in a charge, not in a wild rush, but waiting. Silent figures on a ridge, spears and rifles catching the light. Ethan's heart thudded. He scanned their faces, and then he saw him. The warrior who had spared him stood tall among them. War paint slashed across his cheeks, feathers swaying in his braids. Their eyes met across the distance, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. It was like being struck by lightning, not pain, but a sudden jolt of knowing. The ridge came alive with movement. Ethan didn't need Wilkes's shouted orders to understand. What would happen? The Apaches would slide down the slope, firing from cover, then circle to split the column. He saw it all in his mind before the first shot cracked the air, and when it came, He reacted without thought. Left flank. Rocks, he shouted, jerking his horse to cut across the line. His rifle barked, striking a warrior just as he rose from behind a mesquite. The men beside him looked at him, startled, but his warning saved them from the ambush. The battle raged. Dust, gunfire, the scream of horses, it was chaos, but inside Ethan, clarity burned. He saw each move before it happened. An Apache rider lifted his rifle. Ethan already knew where the shot would land and shoved a fellow soldier aside. Another warrior swung a hatchet, but Ethan's arm was there to block before the blow had even begun to fall. The other soldiers noticed. Price, how in God's name? A corporal gasped, ducking behind him. Ethan couldn't answer. His scar felt like fire, every pulse carrying the rhythm of the fight not just through his body but through his mind. He wasn't just fighting the Apache. He was with them, seeing their strikes, feeling the anger that drove them, the grief that sharpened every blade. And then, in the blur of combat, his gaze locked with Taza's once more. For a breathless second, Ethan saw not the battlefield but something deeper. Children hidden in caves, a woman's wail over a burned hut, the weight of a people hunted and cornered. The fury was not wild, it was righteous, desperate. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. Ethan gasped, his rifle slipping in his grasp. He barely caught himself before a bullet tore past his shoulder dot. By the time the fight broke apart, both sides retreating to lick their wounds, Ethan sat trembling in the saddle. The men around him clapped his back, their eyes wide with something between gratitude and suspicion. "You saved half of us out there," one said, "like you knew where they'd be." Ethan forced a nod, but his throat was dry. He did know. That was the terror of it. Back at the fort, as the men tended wounds and counted losses, Ethan retreated to the shadows of the stable. His scar throbbed so hard it blurred his vision. He pressed both hands to his face and whispered, "What have you done to me?" But he already knew the answer. The Apache hadn't just spared him. They had left him a gift or a curse. Sight. That was not his own, a tether that pulled him into their battles, their grief, their vengeance. The condition had revealed itself, and it was far worse than he had imagined. In the days that followed the skirmish, Ethan Price was spoken of with the kind of awe usually reserved for men touched by Providence. Around the cook fires, soldiers muttered that he had been guided by God himself, that his eyes pierced shadows, that his reflexes bordered on the unnatural. But awe, Ethan quickly learned, was kin to fear. The same men who clapped him on the back in daylight avoided him at night. He caught them watching him when they thought he couldn't see, their gazes sliding to the scar on his cheek as though it were an unhealed wound that might spread. A whisper chased him everywhere. Ghost-marked. Captain Wilkes was the first to voice what the others only dared suggest. He summoned Ethan into his office, the lamplight casting his face into sharp planes. "Price, you fought like no soldier I've seen. Men claim you shouted warnings before bullets flew. Explain yourself." Ethan stood stiff, hands clenched at his sides. "Sir, I can't explain. I only knew, as if the fight had already happened and I was just catching up to it." Wilkes's eyes narrowed. "That sounds less like soldiering and more like witchcraft." He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Be careful, Price. This army doesn't trust what it can't understand, and neither do I." Dismissed, Ethan stepped into the night, the captain's warning echoing louder than the cicadas in the mesquite. The visions grew stronger. By day they came as flashes, knowing when a horse would shy before it spooked, when a rifle would miss fire before it jammed. By night they dragged him into the Apache's grief, the weeping of women mourning their dead, the pounding of drums. Before battle, the searing thirst of warriors walking the desert with no water but vengeance. He was never alone. One evening in the barracks, A private named Harris sidled up to him, nervous but curious. "Price, you got Apache eyes now. That's how you see things, isn't it?" Ethan froze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the mark on your face ain't just a scar. They gave you something. You fight like one of them." Harris spat to the side, suddenly hardening. "We ought to watch you. For all we know, you'll turn on us next fight." The barracks went silent. The men didn't laugh it off. They just stared, waiting for Ethan to protest, to reassure them. But what could he say? That they were wrong, or that they were right? The silence was answer enough. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan found Braddock by the stables again. The old scout chewed on a sliver of tobacco, his eyes glinting like flint in the dark. "You warned me," Ethan said hoarsely. "You said?" "The mark would work its way into my bones. Now it's in my head too. I see their battles before they fight them. I feel their pain as if it were my own." Braddock nodded grimly. "The Apache don't fight only with weapons. They fight with memory. That's what they gave you. A burden heavier than any rifle." Ethan gripped the stall rail until his knuckles whitened. "I saved men's lives out there. Shouldn't that count for something?" Braddock spat into the straw. "Doesn't matter. Soldiers don't want to follow a man they think is half ghost. To them, you ain't a hero. You're proof the Apache touched you." The words sank deep. Ethan realized then that his victories would never free him. Each life he saved only widened the gulf between him and his comrades. They owed him, yes, but they feared him more. When he finally lay down in his bunk, he closed his eyes and whispered, "If this is mercy, God help me from ever knowing their cruelty." The scar pulsed beneath his palm, hot as a coal. And somewhere in the dark, he thought he heard Taz's voice again. "My condition will haunt you forever." The visions no longer waited for night. By the end of summer, Ethan lived in two worlds at once. His body marched, drilled, cleaned rifles with the rest of the garrison, but his mind drifted endlessly between the fort and the firelit canyons of the Apache. He saw raids planned before they were carried out, mothers mourning children who had yet to die, warriors sharpening blades for battles that had not yet begun. Sleep brought no rest, waking brought no peace. His scar pulsed like a second heartbeat, always in rhythm with the drumbeats that haunted him. The men gave him a wide berth now. Even Captain Wilkes no longer called on him for reports. Whispers had hardened into certainty. Ethan Price was touched by the Apache. Not man enough to kill, not man enough to trust. Ghost marked on a moonless night. Unable to bear the barracks walls, Ethan left the fort. He didn't take orders, didn't leave word. His feet carried him out into the desert, following a pull. Deeper than instinct. The stars wheeled above like cold sentinels. Coyotes yipped far off, and the sand whispered beneath his boots. The visions guided him. Step by step, he saw where to turn, which canyon to follow, as though someone else's. Memory was shaping his path. Hours passed, or maybe days' time slipped like water through his hands. When at last he stumbled into a clearing rimmed with towering red stone, the air heavy with smoke, he knew he had reached the place the mark had been dragging him toward. All along, a fire blazed at the center, shadows leaping across the rock walls. Warriors stood in silence, their faces painted, their eyes reflecting the flames. And at the far side of the fire stood Taza. The Apache leader's gaze locked on Ethan's as if he had been waiting. "You came," Taza said in his low, steady English. Not a question, an inevitability. Ethan's throat tightened. "I didn't have a choice." Taza stepped forward, the firelight carving his features into something both mortal and eternal. "That is the condition. You walk with us now, whether you will it or not." Ethan shook his head, despair twisting inside him. "I don't belong to you. I'm a soldier of the United States Army." "And yet," Taza said, pointing to Ethan's scar, "you see as we see. You feel as we feel. When our children starve, you taste the hunger. When our dead cry, you hear their voices. Tell me, soldier, do your brothers in the fort feel this?" "With you?" Ethan faltered. No, they feared him. They looked at him as though he were a rattler waiting to strike. The burden he carried was his alone. Taza's eyes softened, though they burned no less fiercely. "You will never again be only theirs. And you will never be only ours. The mark binds you between." The words fell like a sentence handed down by a judge. Ethan felt the weight of them settle into his bones. Not life, not death between. Sank to his knees, the desert air heavy in his lungs. "Why me?" He whispered. "Because sparing you was worse than killing you," Taza said simply. "A bullet frees a man. Mercy chains him." Silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of fire. Ethan looked into the flames and saw both futures, riding in blue, hated and feared, or walking among the Apache, haunted and foreign, neither. Offered peace. Taza placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, not comfort, but acknowledgement. "You will wander as long as you breathe. In your death, neither side will claim you. That is the path you carry." Ethan bowed his head. He understood then what Braddock could never have explained, what Wilkes would never believe. He was no longer simply Ethan Price. He was the echo of two worlds at war, belonging to both, claimed. By neither dot when he rose again, the firelight caught the scar on his cheek, and it seemed to blaze like a brand. The Apache had spared him, but they had also condemned him to walk forever as a man with no home, no kin, only the endless weight of mercy. And in the silence of the desert night, Ethan finally understood. Taza had kept his promise. The condition would haunt him forever,